Hello, fellow students of history. If you are watching this soon after I recorded it, then currently part of my house is being destroyed because we had a leak in a wall that we didn't realize we had. Nobody noticed it until the house started to grow the sort of mold that it grows when it's trying to get your attention or kill you, whichever comes first. So there will be a hiatus in posting videos of a couple of weeks because it will be very difficult to be heard. We left off part 1 of lecture 18 here with the shortcomings of Hoover's top-down solutions when it came to alleviating actual human suffering on the ground. We saw the development of Hoovervilles, as well as hunger marches, pressuring government at all levels to make more practical and immediately effective interventions. In part 2 here, we will pick up with the so-called bonus army, also called the bonus expeditionary force, that provided a highly visible example of what was happening all across the US. To understand this protest, we need to take a quick trip back to 1919 and the end of World War I. Americans who had served in the Great War had been paid only $1 a day, which even then wasn't much, for domestic service, and $1.25 for overseas service. That would be where you could get killed. Moreover, of the 4.8 million American men who fought in World War I, approximately 2.8 million, little over half, had been drafted, meaning that they had been pulled out of their ordinary life course and thrust into the military. After the war, these men pushed for some sort of additional compensation in order to restart their lives. In 1924, Congress finally responded to the demands of veterans with the World War Adjusted Compensation Act that would fill in the gaps left by the failure to pay soldiers adequately by giving them a cash bonus, although there was a catch, as we will see in a moment. The bill was vetoed by Republican President Calvin Coolidge, who stated that patriotism which is bought and paid for is not patriotism, because you should happily go somewhere else and die while your family starves. But Coolidge's veto was overridden by Congress and the bill became law. Now, here's the catch. Veterans who were scheduled to receive $50 or less would receive their money immediately, but everyone else was issued a certificate like the one that you see on the right side here. Those certificates could not be redeemed for cash until 1945. Remember, the act was passed in 1924? That's 21 years on top of the years that veterans had waited between the end of World War I and the passage of the Adjusted Compensation Act. The only way the bonus could be paid before that date was for the recipient to die and allow his heirs to collect the money. Veterans started calling the payment the tombstone bonus. Initially, they worked through Congress to try to change the system, but with the crash and the ensuing Great Depression, the bonus became an urgent issue for these men and their families. In March of 1932, as unemployed workers marched on the Ford factory in Dearborn, Michigan, what we ended the last lecture with, an unemployed former Army sergeant named Walter W. Waters, 3 W's in a row, addressed a meeting of World War veterans in Portland, Oregon. Waters believed that the ability to petition government was a basic American right guaranteed in the First Amendment, and he wanted the veterans to exercise that right before the Congress. Waters suggested that other veterans join him in boarding a freight train since they had zero money for passenger fares and heading to Washington, D.C. to demand the money they believed that they were rightfully due. And you can see it says on the side of this with all of these people packed in it, Washington or bust. That is Washington, D.C., not Washington State. And in bonus, we trust. World War veterans. And this tells you something too. It doesn't say World War I veterans because they didn't know there was another one coming up. By early May, Waters had 300-ish followers, and they headed to Washington, D.C. to push for the immediate payment of their bonuses. As word of the group spread, other veterans units in other states formed and also headed to Washington. Radio stations and local newspapers reported on the growing bonus army and its mission, drawing more and more into the group. By the time they arrived in Washington, D.C., there were more than 25,000 veterans, plus their families. Pressuring Congress to do something that they do not want to do is not a quick process. So bonus army members were in it for the long haul. Moreover, these men and their families had no homes to return to, and without the bonus could not rent or purchase living spaces. They would need a place to live in Washington, D.C. This is a group on arrival, and you can see they are just piled up, sleeping on the ground in front of the Capitol building. The most reasonable thing to do was to set up Hoovervilles close enough to the Capitol that the bonus army stood at least some chance of having their concerns be visible. Fortunately for the protesters, Pelham Glassford, the local police chief, who was himself a veteran of World War I, made accommodations for this influx. Glassford himself was a character, you can see him here, who rode on a blue Harley-Davidson motorcycle around the city and often stopped to chat with homeless people. Of greater importance to us here, Glassford understood that Americans had a right to assemble in Washington, D.C. and petition the government for the, quote, redress of grievances without fear of punishment or reprisals. The areas that Glassford set aside for bonus army Hoovervilles included space for an enormous camp in the Anacostia Flats. That's a section of Washington, D.C. close to the Capitol, but separated by a drawbridge across the Anacostia River. The placement of this camp will become important in a moment, so I have given you a map here. Here, the bonus army camp is shown in with modern features, things that weren't there at the time necessarily. But you can see the relative positions of the White House here, the U.S. Capitol here, the Anacostia River here, and the camp down here. The bonus army organized marches past the Capitol building on a nearly daily basis to keep their cause in the eyes of both government and the American people. In the picture on the slide here, they are wearing uniforms. They're uniforms from the World War, but some days they wore neat civilian clothing. Walter Waters had become the leader of the group. He was extremely careful that members of the bonus army behaved with dignity, no panhandling, no drinking alcohol, and no radical talk. As Waters said, I love this country. I'm emphatically not advocating revolution. These were all military war veterans. They were in no way, shape, or form communists. Keep this in your mind. On 15 June, the House of Representatives passed a new bonus bill by a vote of 211 to 176. 2 days later, 17 June, some 8,000 veterans massed in front of the Capitol as the Senate prepared to vote. Because remember, the bill would have to be passed by both the House of Representatives and the Senate. Another 10,000 bonus army members assembled on the far side of the raised Anacostia drawbridge. The police prepared for trouble that might arise in the large crowds. The Senate debate continued until after dark. Finally, at 9:30 p.m., Waters learned that the bill had been defeated and shared the news with his followers. When news of the vote arrived, observers worried that the veterans massed near the Capitol might turn to violence. Walter Waters, at the head of the crowd, threw his hands in the air and called out, "Sing America!" Some of the men near Waters began to belt out "America the Beautiful." The tension of the moment broke, and the veterans headed back to their camps. No violence. Despite the failure of the bonus bill in Congress, thousands of bonus marchers stayed in Washington, D.C., determined not to give up. Now, before we go on, remember that as in Ludlow and as in other Hoovervilles, this was a community of families, and they had nowhere else to go. After 2 months of looking out from the White House at the Veterans Pennsylvania Avenue shantytown, President Herbert Hoover had had enough. He directed Army Chief of Staff General Douglas MacArthur, whose name you may recognize from World War II, to disperse the bonus army. Army Chief of Staff MacArthur was convinced that the bonus army march represented a communist conspiracy to undermine the government of the United States, but that was simply not the case. Several commanders reported to MacArthur that most of the men seemed to be vehemently anti-communist, if anything. According to journalist and eyewitness Joseph C. Harsh, this was not a revolutionary situation. This was a bunch of people in great distress wanting help. These were simply veterans from World War I who were out of luck, out of money, and wanted to get their bonus. And they needed the money at that moment. The bonus army camps had a library, schools, and musical bands. These people looked out for one another. That was the only sense in which, to use the words of the mayor of the Chicago Hooverville that we saw earlier, these folks were communistic. Now, no group is perfect, but in this image with the piano, you can see a variety of people gathered together, many of them smiling despite their situation. Hoover and MacArthur couldn't see past the mass of poverty to the people, and they could not really understand the poverty that they saw. Initially, on 28 July, Hoover's officials sent in the Washington police to evict the marchers. The action was peaceful until someone somewhere threw a brick. The police reacted with force, and 2 bonus marchers were shot. The situation quickly spiraled out of control, and this rather predictable juncture was when Hoover sent in the army, led by General Douglas MacArthur. But this was a job that MacArthur had been anxious to do, and he went in with force. For 2 months, General MacArthur had been secretly training his troops for this moment. By the time MacArthur got his orders from the president, the general had already commanded troops from Fort Myer, Virginia, to cross the Potomac and assemble on the ellipse, the grassy lawn across from the White House. MacArthur's principal aide, Major Dwight D. Eisenhower, urged restraint on the general. But MacArthur, who ordered Eisenhower to accompany him, assumed personal command of his long-anticipated military operation, a military operation aimed against America's own citizens. For the first time in the nation's history, tanks rolled through the streets of the U.S. Capitol. MacArthur ordered his men to clear the downtown of veterans and spectators who had been drawn to the scene by radio reports. Nearly 200 mounted cavalry set out with their sabers drawn. At the head of this contingent rode their executive officer, George S. Patton, followed by 5 tanks and about 300 helmeted infantrymen brandishing loaded rifles with fixed bayonets. And you can see here, the infantry are wearing gas masks. They threw in tear gas, and they also have rifles with the bayonets, the sharp pointy bits mounted on them, and they've completely surrounded this group of people. The cavalry drove most pedestrians, curious onlookers, civil servants, and members of the bonus army, many with wives and children, off the streets. Infantrymen wearing gas masks hurled hundreds of tear gas grenades at the already dispersing crowd. By 7 p.m., soldiers had evacuated the entire downtown section of the bonus army Hooverville, displacing as many as 2,000 men, women, and children, along with countless bystanders. Eyewitnesses, including future President Eisenhower, insisted that Hoover had forbade any troops to cross the bridge into Anacostia, and that at least 2 high-ranking officers were dispatched to convey these orders to MacArthur. MacArthur blatantly ignored them. Now, I will say, Hoover issued these orders not because he was worried about the people in the Hooverville, but because he was worried that it would make his image look bad, and there was an election coming up. By 9 o'clock, MacArthur's troops were crossing the bridge to Anacostia. There, bonus army leaders were given somewhere between 20 minutes and an hour to evacuate entire families before troops swooped down, driving off some 2,000 veterans with tear gas and setting fire to the camp, which quickly burned. Around 11 p.m., MacArthur called a press conference to justify his actions, saying, and this is a quote, "Had the president not acted today, had he permitted this thing to go on for 24 hours more, he would have been faced with a grave situation, which would have caused a real battle had he let it go on another week. I believe the institutions of our government would have been severely threatened." These were people with no weapons, aside from bricks, no homes, not much in the way of food, who had already been there for months without overthrowing the government somehow. Some Americans bought MacArthur's shtick, but over the next few days, newspapers and theater newsreels that were shown before films showed graphic images of fleeing veterans and their families, blazing shacks, clouds of tear gas, soldiers wielding fixed bayonets, and cavalrymen waving sabers. Within a week, the images of that night were all over the country. In every little town, people watched the newsreels and they saw the tanks in the American streets, the tear gas, and MacArthur driving out the troops that had won the First World War. So he was using the army against the people who had fought for America in the World War. And Americans weren't totally thrilled about that. The narration to one newsreel said, "These veterans, quote, are being forced out of their shacks by the troops who have been called out by the President of the United States." In movie theaters across America where these newsreels played, MacArthur was booed and jeered. This was in July of 1932. Just 4 months later, Americans would be voting in the presidential election of 1932. After reading newspaper accounts of MacArthur's eviction, Hoover's opponent, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, told an advisor that, quote, "This will elect me. These are the ruins of the camp." In fact, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR, was correct. He won the 1932 election by substantial margins. FDR took a very different approach to Hoover in dealing with the financial woes of the American people, and we will take a look at his take in the next lecture. Key points for Lecture 18. President Hoover did not really grasp the structure of poverty. This was particularly clear in his response to the Great Depression. He had only 3 ideas of what to do, and he kept trying those over and over. Tariffs, that we talked about in the last half of the lecture, high interest loans to banks and big businesses, in the hopes that the benefits would work their way down to the poor, volunteerism, which relied on voluntary contributions from the wealthy and from organizations like churches. Impoverished Americans mocked Hoover by attaching his name to the trappings of their poverty. So, for example, Hoover blankets for the newspapers used as bedding for folks without homes. The most striking signs of poverty were the Hoovervilles that grew up in and around American cities. These were essentially homeless encampments, and their size and ubiquity made the level of desperation among impoverished groups highly visible. Labor activism was strong during the Depression as the working class tried to get employers and politicians to find solutions that would actually make a meaningful difference for the poor. The American Communist Party, as it was, helped to organize labor activism and hunger marches. Hunger marches were literally starving people marching with signs and suggesting lists of potential solutions to those in power. The American Communist Party advocated for unemployment insurance, school lunches, and safety from eviction. The Communist Party also accepted all workers, regardless of race, sex, age, or skill level. The Bonus Army, also called the Bonus Expeditionary Force, was made up of World War I veterans from across the United States who gathered in Washington, D.C. to request immediate payment of military bonuses they were owed for their service. Members of the Bonus Army came with family because they had no homes. They created large Hoovervilles in Washington, D.C. The Bonus Army organized peaceful marches on a nearly daily basis. Hoover and MacArthur used the U.S. Army with weapons to clear and destroy the Bonus Army encampments. The press showed newsreels and photos of the destruction of the Bonus Army camps. The use of the active army against people who had defended the cause of the U.S. in the Great War and who were accompanied by families seemed reprehensible to most, albeit not all, Americans. MacArthur tried to justify his actions by saying that the people in the Bonus Army encampments were communists and radicals, reaching back to prejudice against labor activism developed in the Gilded Age. Hoover lost the 1932 presidential election to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR, by large margins. This is what Central Park in New York City looks like in the early 21st century. Located in what is now the center of Manhattan, Central Park gets an estimated 42 million visits a year, making it one of, if not the, most visited urban parks in the country, and one of the most popular destinations in New York City for residents and tourists alike. Through lectures so far, we've been seeing urban areas in the northeastern U.S. develop rapidly right from the beginning of our time period. We've also looked at New York tenements, poverty, and health issues. As fewer people lived in rural spaces, the popularity of landscape tourism, going out to look at a waterfall, something like that, and urban green spaces grew among the middle class. Even before the Progressive Era, New York's leaders saw the value of a dedicated green space, especially if it were grand enough to make New York City attractive to tourists from Europe. The image that you are looking at on this slide is Hyde Park in London. This is the sort of grand scale that New York's leaders had in mind in the mid-19th century. In 1853, New York State officials approved funds to purchase the land from 59th to 106th Streets between 5th and 8th Avenues. When most of us hear Fifth Avenue now, we picture something like the modern image that I showed in the first slide of the coda. But if you had seen the same spot in the 1850s, It looked rather more like the image on the slide. The land was rocky and swampy. It was home to small farms and villages, nothing larger. We will come back to the largest of those towns, Seneca Village, in just a moment. In 1857, the Central Park Commission held a landscape design contest and selected the greensward plan that you see on the slide there, submitted by Frederick Law Olmsted, the park's superintendent at the time, and Calvert Vaux, an English-born architect. The designers sought to create a pastoral landscape in the English Romantic tradition, with areas of open rolling meadows contrasted with the picturesque effects of the Ramble, a woodland region, as well as areas featuring more formal gardens. In order to maintain a feeling of uninterrupted expanse, Olmsted and Vaux sank 4 transverse roads 8 feet below the park's surface to carry crosstown traffic. The plan was gorgeous. The only issue was that there were already folks living on the land that New York wanted to make into a park, roughly 1,600 inhabitants. The city acquired the land through what is called eminent domain. That's the law that allows the government to take private land for public use with compensation paid to the landowner. This was a common practice in the 19th century and had been used to build Manhattan's grid of streets decades earlier. Although landowners were compensated, many argued that their land was undervalued, and that may well be true. One of the areas inhabitants had to vacate by 1857 was the region you see above the old reservoir in the red box. That region held Seneca Village. So you can see there's an old reservoir and a new reservoir, and Seneca Village was located right in here. And this is the plan for all of Central Park. Seneca Village flourished as a predominantly African-American community, one of the limited number of places where Black Americans owned land without a lot of harassment. Roughly 225 of the 1,600 total residents displaced through the process of eminent domain lived in Seneca Village. For Black Americans, Seneca Village existed as an autonomous community at the time far from the densely populated downtown. New York State abolished slavery in 1827, but as we saw with the draft riots during the Civil War, this did not translate into equitable treatment. In the mid-1800s, Seneca Village provided a relatively remote and safe location. Compared to other Black Americans living in New York, residents of Seneca Village experienced greater stability, safety, and prosperity. By 1855, approximately half of Seneca Village residents owned their own homes. And remember, at that time, property ownership was what qualified someone for the right to vote. In 1821, New York State required African American men to own at least $250 in property and hold residency for at least 3 years to be able to vote. White park planners pushed the fiction that the people living on the land slated for the park were poor squatters living in ramshackle huts. In reality, most lived in 2-story homes. Census records show that residents were employed and that children who lived in Seneca Village attended school. We have seen the displacement of Black Americans from their homes to make way for white neighborhoods or development projects before in this class, and we will, unfortunately, see it again. It is a repeating theme in American history. You saw the map on the right 2 slides ago. I've rotated it here so that it lines up with the photo. In both images, the Seneca Village region is on the lower right. In the 1931 photo on the left there, The massive building actually in the park here, extending into the park, on the upper left is the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which happens to be one of my absolute favorite places, despite its problematic nature. Between these two, what was Seneca Village and what is now the Metropolitan Museum of Art, is what was called the receiving reservoir on the old map. In the 1931 image, that reservoir has been drained, and the plan was to turn the space into the Great Lawn, a feature which actually exists in that space now. But in the early 1930s, construction was halted with the reservoir partially filled because of the Great Depression. This is a view across the drained reservoir with the Met behind us. So if we were standing here, the Metropolitan Museum would be behind us, and Central Park West in the background. And this image was taken in 1932. As more and more folks in the region were rendered homeless by the Great Depression, people began to set up an informal camp in the drained reservoir. They were soon evicted, as we saw in Seattle, but having nowhere to go, as in Seattle, they would just return. And as public sentiment became more sympathetic, these people were allowed to stay. Called Hoover Valley, the reservoir developed a row of shacks along what was then called Depression Street. People used the skills that they had and the materials to hand to build this Central Park Hooverville. It is hard to see in this image, but on the left here is a brick building created by out-of-work bricklayers from found bricks. Just left of center in the background is the mansion that we saw a closer view of in lecture part 1. It was built with stone blocks from the reservoir. These people here, incidentally, are tourists coming to see. This man has built his shack in a disused water conduit from the former reservoir. There were new apartment buildings going up next to Central Park, and it looks like he has taken building scraps, maybe linoleum in some cases, to decorate his home. I don't know what the arrow is there for. Popularly, Hoover's name, associated with the outward signs of desperate poverty, came to mean indifference because the poor and middle classes alike felt that Hoover had no real sympathy for non-elite Americans. This was why those living around Hooverville largely did not fight to have folks evicted. And by people living around Hooverville, I mean the ones living in the incredibly expensive apartments around the edges. That said, tolerance is not the same as legality, and displaced folks in Central Park were periodically arrested. But even then, there was broad sympathy. In July of 1931, police arrested 22 men for sleeping rough in the park. The judge suspended all of the men's sentences and gave each man $2 of his own money. $2 is a big deal then. The New York Times reported the case of 9 men living in 6 shacks who were arrested for vagrancy, but had their charges dropped. The article observed that those living in the Central Park Hooverville, quote, make themselves look presentable and keep their shacks as clean as they can. One Hooverville resident told the reporter, "We work hard to keep it clean because that is important. I never lived like this before." I will end this coda here with a picture of Central Park's Great Lawn as it looks now in fine weather.